in the Emirates. She's back in the States and lives in Virginia. And so we're very, very fortunate to get her insight on, the intersection of Islam and psychology and spirituality. And I'm hoping that we're going to have a very vibrant Q&A session as well. So as you're listening to her presentation, and you have any thoughts, save them for the end and we'll take questions. So without further ado, thank you, Dr. York. And we look forward to your presentation.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillah. First of all, I just want to say how honored I am that it seems that this is the first event in this beautiful, beautiful mosque. I mean, it's stunning, really, how beautiful it is. So thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor. I have basically... book. So those are sort of the three things that I'll cover, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So the first part, the Al-Karam Institute. So as the Imam said, the Al-Karam Institute was established almost 7 years ago. We are a nonprofit organization, and our mission is advancing Islamic psychology to benefit society and improve lives. And our vision is to become the first Muslim graduate school of psychology in the United States. We currently offer the first and only program in Islamic psychology in the United States, and there are really only a few programs in the world. Ours started, I think, this around the same time as the program at Cambridge Muslim College, and I think since then there's been one or two other programs that have sort of popped up. So I'm busy, running the Institute, running our Islamic psychology program. We have an in-house publication wing called Al-Karam Press, which is the publisher of the book that I'm going to talk about today, as well as another book that I came out with last year. I brought copies for your library, so if anybody's interested, you can certainly buy them on Amazon or wherever you like to buy books, but we do have a couple of copies to put in the library here if you'd like to check that out. And then we have other things going on at the Institute as well, like we have an Islamic Psychology Research Fellowship. We created that because as of right now, there is no formal master's or doctorate in Islamic psychology or psychology rooted in an Islamic worldview. And so one of the ways that we're trying to solve that problem until we can we can become a degree granting institution is by having the Islamic Psychology Research Fellowship. So that's designed for master's or doctoral students already enrolled in a regular program, a master's, a PhD, either in psychology or Islamic studies. That's the thing. Islamic psychology is not just, people who are involved in it are not just psychologists or related field, but it could also be Islamic studies. So they usually want to do their master's thesis or doctoral dissertation on an Islamic psychology topic, but usually the institution that they're already enrolled in does not have any faculty that specialize in Islamic psychology, so they can apply for a fellowship and we can provide that expertise. We have quite a number of applicants. We're not able to, support all of the projects, but we've had a number of really, really good scholarship. So it sort of advances the field before we're even able to formally offer a degree. And then, of course, we have publications and research and were involved in, lots of different areas, or even me personally being involved in the American Psychological Association, which is the largest psychological association in the world. I think in the United States, I think we're around 150,000 members. And so I regularly present on Islamic psychology. And so, we can get into this later if there's questions about that, or if there's interest. But there's always this idea, about religion and spirituality sort of being antithetical to mainstream psychology or secular psychology. And I can talk more about that, but it's a very complex topic, because on the one hand, yes, that's true, but on the other hand, no, it's not true, because we have a whole field of psychology, of religion, and spirituality within the context of mainstream psychology. The American Psychological Association, I think, has about I want to say like 52 or 54 different divisions that focus on different aspects of psychology, because psychology is a huge field, right? We say psychology, but it's huge. It's so many different branches and subfields. So there's a whole division dedicated to specifically studying religion and spirituality, and so it's an actual sort of subfield within the broader field. So that's a little bit about the Al-Karam Institute. Now I'll talk a little bit about the intro to the book. So let me get a copy here. You can see it here. So here's the title of the book is Heartfulness, Islamic Spiritual Practices for Health and Wellbeing. This came out last month. And here's the book that we came out with last year. You can ask me about that at the end if you'd like, and I'll touch a little bit upon it in this talk. This one is called The Way of Love Towards an Islamic Psychology of Virtues and Character Development. So the intro to the book, Heartfulness, I am going to read you a little bit from the book, and specifically the preface, and that'll give you sort of a context for how the book came about and my role and my own personal experience with this topic. Okay, so this is from the preface. I won't read the whole thing, I'll just read a bit of it. So, putting together an edited volume on spiritual practices and well-being is somewhat of a full circle moment for me. It was through my personal experience with spiritual healing practices and modalities that I entered into my career as a psychologist some 20 years ago. In the early years of my doctoral work, I was very interested in Reiki, a Japanese energy modality. I also experimented with modalities like holotropic breath work, metta or loving kindness meditation. And then later, for my doctoral dissertation, I explored the Islamic modality of ruqya, Quranic healing, and its use on non-Muslims. And we can talk a little bit about that if you're interested. At that time, all of my scholarship was positioned primarily within the context of transpersonal psychology and complementary and alternative medicine. And I often cited important work being done at the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, which is now called the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. This is the federal government's lead agency for scientific research on complementary and integrative health approaches, and is one of the 27 institutes, centers, and offices that make up the National Institutes of Health within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The mere existence of such an institution, which was founded in 1998, and the fact that it has grown to the extent that the name has already been revised, gives insight into just how robust this field actually is. Back in those early years, I used to look at the list of complementary and alternative medicine, CAM modalities on the NCCIH website, and I used to think how unfortunate it was that Islamic modalities were nowhere on the menu. I also used to think that these modalities had great potential to help non-Muslims. I argued that you didn't have to be Chinese to use and benefit from acupuncture, nor did you have to be a Buddhist or a Hindu to meditate or do yoga and benefit from those modalities either. Similarly, you didn't need to be Muslim to use or benefit from an Islamic spiritual practice or healing intervention, but the only problem was that unless you were Muslim, you probably had never heard of them. Since that time, it became my personal mission to put Islamic spiritual healing practices and modalities onto the proverbial menu. This book is one more effort I have made over the years towards that broader goal. I'd like to mention that this book comes out on the heels of another book that I just edited entitled The Way of Love: Towards an Islamic Psychology of Virtues and Character Development, and that's this book. Both books are essentially on the same topic, Islamic spirituality. What's different are the scholarly domains and contexts in which each book is positioned. The Way of Love is about Islamic spirituality within the fields of positive psychology. And we can talk a little bit about what that is if you'd like. Positive psychology and scholarship on virtue and character development. Heartfulness is also about Islamic spirituality, but within the context of the health, well-being, and complementary and alternative medicine contexts. So it's my hope that the work presented in both books demonstrates how one particular topic, in this case, Islamic spirituality, can have relevance to and indeed advance so many different domains and in so many different ways. I can't emphasize how vital it is that Islamic and Muslim perspectives be part of scientific and academic life in order to set and advance research agendas for these areas and beyond. The ways in which all of this can be done, though, are endless. So that provides a little bit of context, I hope, for the book, how it came about, as well as my role in that. And so, and as I mentioned in that, early, some 20 years ago, I actually did, as I mentioned in the reading, I did my doctoral dissertation on the use of ruqya on non-Muslims. And I actually published that study in another book. And so you can, like I said, you can ask me about that and we can talk about that if it's interesting. But, those participants had a very, very powerful response to that. Me personally, and this goes back to what I was talking about, like my own personal experience. I've tried a number of different methods and I've also had, very profound healing experiences with various Islamic modalities. And so the research is there, but there's still this, need to grow Islamic practices as it relates to research and sort of putting them on the menu. Okay, so that's the intro to the book and how I sort of came about to that. Now we'll sort of get into the meat of the book. Now, when we talk about Islamic spiritual practices and this idea of heartfulness, actually, I should say that the original title of this book, the main title was always Heartfulness, but the subtitle was different. As we were putting the book together over, the course of like a year or two, it was always Heartfulness, Islamic mindfulness, meditation, and other psycho-spiritual practices or something along those lines. Because really, when we're talking about these kinds of spiritual practices today, we're talking about mindfulness, meditation, things like yoga. I mean, there's even expressions, things like McMindfulness, right? Because mindfulness is everywhere today, or yoga. And so it's really this idea that Islam has these types of practice, its own version of these practices. And so it's about really bringing these to the menu. And so the book sort of portrays the various types of practices that exist, and the different contexts that they can be studied in, and the different things that they can be used for. I mean, really, it is endless. When you sort of get into the research and the literature about some of, using some of these practices for different types of things, it really does, I always talk about, we talk about like Islamic psychology and what Islamic psychology is, and that's a whole other thing. In our Islamic psychology program, we spend the first couple sessions of our program just sort of talking about that, like what is that and what are the different definitions and conceptualizations of that. But it's the same thing when you talk about Islamic spiritual practices and their application and the things that they can be used for. The permutations can also sort of be endless. So just to give you a little taste of what some of this specific work looks like, I have to start off by saying that the contributors to this book are really, whether it's the faculty in our Islamic psychology program, some of whom did contribute to this book, or it's our researchers and fellows and scholars who contribute, they're really doing some amazing and cutting edge work, both within the context of sort of Islamic psychology or Islamic spiritual practices, or just generally speaking. For example, one of the chapters in the book, chapter 2, the impact of heartfulness. Oh, let me start with chapter 1. Chapter 1, from mindfulness to heartfulness, a Sufi Islamic perspective on being and spiritual practice. And this is by Rena Ismail, who's a professor actually at the American University of Beirut. She's one of our faculty in our program. She sort of opens the book by defining these terms and looking at what heartfulness really is from an Islamic perspective, right? Because if that's what the book is about, heartfulness as opposed to mindfulness, because Islam has its own view of, first of all, who we are as human beings, right? These different structures of the self, whether it's your nafs or aql or qalb or ruh, you have these different concepts. And so when you're talking about mindfulness or heartfulness, you have to first begin with an Islamic understanding about who we are as human beings, right? The structure of the human self, right? Who are we? What are the different structures that we have? What are their functions? So that this is a really beautiful chapter that starts with that and just explaining like what heartfulness is from an Islamic perspective, and how that sort of compares and contrasts to some of the other ideas that are prevalent of the day. In terms of chapter 2, all of them are great chapters, but this chapter really, I think, demonstrates where the best of sort of, we say like pure or hardcore science comes together with religion and spirituality. This chapter, the title is The Impact of Heartfulness on Health and Heredity via Epigenomic Regulation. So this chapter was written by Dr. Farah Zahir, who is, mashallah, she's a scholar. She really bridges both worlds. So she has a PhD in like molecular biology and genetics, but she also has multiple, she's a sheikha also, she has multiple ijazas in various Islamic sciences. So she really straddles both worlds. In the scientific world, I believe she's even like discovered like 9 different neurodevelopmental disorders. So she really is a very hard-hitting, scientist in the mainstream world. And what she pulls together in her chapter is this idea of her area of expertise, which has to do with epigenetics. So epigenetics is this field of science that explores how the environment impacts gene expression. And so she sort of goes into the details of that and sort of lays that out, what that is. And then she talks about the use of spiritual practices and various spiritual practices. I mean, you name it. It could be salat, it could be dhikr, it could be, you fill in the practice, and the potential of these various spiritual practices to change your genes, to impact gene expression. So obviously this is a very, you have to have a very particular expertise in order to really, understand this. I mean, we're from a very deep level. And so that's really a chapter that just fascinates me in terms of thinking about, we talk about, at the level of behavior, we talk about in psychology, like how our childhood, our environment can affect us. And so we kind of know this already. And even there are teachings in Islam that talk about, keeping sahba, keeping good company, right? Because our environment impacts us. And so we know that at a sort of more superficial level, but this chapter sort of goes into what that looks like at a molecular and genetic level. Just very briefly, there's a chapter on Islamic mindfulness and recovery from addiction. So using spiritual practices for addiction. And this is by one of our faculty, Sarah Moore, who really is an expert in, she's an addiction specialist, but she really, she's published extensively on tasawwuf, tazkiyah, and various spiritual practices for the treatment of addiction. And I think she even has a chapter in the Way of Love book where she even goes through and kind of outlines, anybody familiar with like Alcoholics Anonymous or 12-step programs. You look at what those 12 steps are and you think you're reading something like Islamic, right? This idea of accepting a higher power and submitting your will to the higher power and realizing that you're helpless except through the higher power and helping you with your addiction or through any of your other problems, really. So she lays out, beautifully the use of various spiritual practices and addiction. There's a chapter, Easing Distress and Increasing Acceptance, Islamic Mindfulness for Patients Diagnosed with Cancer, also used for chronic pain. And then one of the chapters covers a mindfulness program that's based on the teachings of Imam al-Ghazali and some other Quran paradigms. So I think even just sort of skimming the titles of the chapters goes back to what I was saying in terms of how diversified the field can be, that it's not just one thing, but there's so many different ways that it can be used. Just a couple of other things that I want to mention, and they're sort of discussion points that that are relevant to and really core when you're talking about Islamic spiritual practices within the context of, psychology or health and well-being or complementary and alternative medicine. And it's just a couple of things, but it's really, really, really critical. That is, one, we have to, as Muslims in general, when we're talking about something like Islam or Islamic practices, engaging with something like Western psychology or complementary and alternative therapies. We have to be careful to not dichotomize things and think that Islam is over here and Western is over here. There are no doubt, definitely things that are distinct about Islam and the Islamic tradition. But there are many things that exist, even in mainstream psychology, that might get labeled as Western, but are inherently Islamic and not antithetical to the Islamic worldview. So that's one thing. We have to be careful about dichotomizing things. We should think, as Muslims, I mean, if we talk about tawheed and unity, we have to think in that way. We have to think where the connections are, as opposed to putting ourselves over in the corner as we're Muslim over here. And no, we have to think holistically when we're engaging the different spheres that we're, in terms of our context. So that's one thing critical when discussing these topics. Another thing has to do with the importance of having Muslim and Islamic perspectives advancing research agendas, and specifically within the context of psychology or health and well-being or mental health. And that is the idea that it's important for us to be creators of science, creators of psychology, as opposed to just consumers of somebody else's science. But it has to be rooted in our Islamic worldview, and that's the starting point. So it doesn't mean that, everything about, and this is, I'm sure you all know this, but again, it's thinking holistically about rooting in an Islamic worldview in terms of our beliefs about who we are as people. God exists, people have a soul, and he's told us many things about human nature, human life. That's our starting point, but it's not the end point. And so this is really, really critical. And I would say that today, people always ask me about, sort of what my experience has been like as a psychologist of faith. And in fact, the American Psychological Association recently published an article on me specifically because of my work in Islamic psychology. And so my experience, and I realize that this is not the case with everybody, but my experience today has been quite positive, because I would say the climate of diversity and inclusion, this sort of general atmosphere of wanting diverse voices, I have been invited to do research projects. I've been invited to speak at the American Psychological Association. Specifically, I mean, look, you check the diversity box, but that's a good thing. We should take advantage of that. So I would say, psychology today is looking for these diverse voices, and so definitely there's a big space for that, not just a little space. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that the whole field of religion and psychology, I mean, it's a big field. But the caveat is that unless you're involved in that field, there is still a lot of ignorance of it, because psychology is so big. I mean, I'm not updated on all of the different areas that, are going on in psychology. And so if you're somebody over and, doing other kind of research, it's possible that you're also not up to date. So it's just, having these Islamic and Muslim perspectives, because not only, I mean, when we talk about developing these fields, whether it's Islamic psychology or Islamic spiritual practices, whether it's, for use within Muslim communities or beyond, it's always thinking, again, with the mindset that we start with our roots in our Islamic worldview, but especially in a non-Muslim American context. One of the things that I'm always talking about with our students in the Islamic psychology program is that we always have to think, what relevance might this have to non-Muslims and in a non-Muslim context. And again, that goes back to this idea of being creators of psychological science, not just for Muslims. Yes, that's the low-hanging fruit. Developing Islamic frameworks of psychology, we know that the low-hanging fruit is the applicability of this on Muslims. But it doesn't stop there either. It's about thinking about what relevance this has beyond that scope. And I would say that could potentially be even more important when you're getting outside of Muslim spaces into non-Muslim spaces, having those Muslim and Islamic perspectives advancing the agendas. Okay, I think I'll leave it there. And because we've gone for about 40 minutes, and I'd love to answer any questions that you would like to ask about this book, the previous book, anything related to my work. So thank you. Yes. You.
I'll hold the microphone. So if you could just indicate, and I'll give them the mic.
I think there's a brother here. And thank you for.
Thank you very much for your scholarly talk and all the work you have done. My question is, can you give us some example of Islamic modalities that we can actually get some idea of what are those and how both Muslims and non-Muslim can benefit? And if you can also contrast with what are the conventional modalities and how do we contrast with Islamic modalities, that would be very helpful.
Thank you. So that's a huge question, because the answer is huge. When you're talking about different modalities, do you mean the specific spiritual practices? Yeah. Well. Yeah. Well, I mean, it was something that something that we're all familiar with is dhikr, right? Dhikr is something that's so easy to do. I mean, you could even do something as simple. I mean, it doesn't have to be complicated, right? You could use dhikr even sort of like as a thought stopping. There are people who suffer from like rumination, or they're not able to get out of their thoughts. Imagine if you change your somebody who has obsessive thinking, replace those thoughts with La ilaha illallah. Focus on that, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, as opposed to your thinking. That's something you can leave tonight and start doing. That's something you could do right now if you're sitting in your chairs and you're ruminating. I mean, there's probably people in the room that are maybe somewhere lost in your thoughts. That's a very, very, that doesn't require anything. That's something that you know already. Right? Or even, like I said, for example, when I did my doctoral dissertation on the use of ruqya, it's basically reading Quran. You don't even have to go to a sheikh to do that. If you know any Quranic recitation, you can recite that on yourself, or you could recite that on your child. That's a tool you have in your hand right now that doesn't require any training whatsoever. The research shows that people benefit from this. My own research shows that even the non-Muslims who have done these things also benefited, and in some cases had quite profound healing experiences.
So what's the contrast? So non-Muslim obviously is not going to do La ilaha illallah.
Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do. I've seen many non-Muslims, and we can talk about this later, I often receive a lot of Muslims that will do dhikr and they report benefit, and you can see the research. So, but when you talk about like comparing that with, other types of practices, well, what specifically? Do you mean like psychotherapeutic approaches? Do you mean other spiritual approaches? I mean, again, the list is sort of endless. We can come back to that. It's just, you know what it is? It's such a huge, it's so vast,
Thank you. Thank you so much for introducing us to this interesting application of psychology. I actually have two questions.
Yeah.
So you talked about research in spiritual psychology. Could you talk a bit more about how do we really measure or some of the things that we measure to see the impact of spiritual practices, either subjective or objective? And then what are some of the challenges that you have faced in doing a research in, I guess, spiritual or Islamic psychology?
Yeah. Okay. So, sorry, what was the first part of your question? It was on
What are some of the things that you would
measure outcome, measuring outcomes, endless. I mean, even the chapters in this book, one person is talking about chronic pain and somebody else is talking about cancer. Somebody else is talking about addiction. So, I mean, whatever the pathology is, whether it's a physical ailment or it's a psychological one or even a spiritual one, I mean, you take your pick, right? There could be something that I mean, literally to the extent, I mean, in some of the research, I've even seen, it's not a study I did, but just in like perusing the different literature, I saw even somebody do a study that looked at the effect of salat on erectile dysfunction. Erectile dysfunction. So, I mean, you name it. I mean, you choose the disorder, you choose the spiritual practice, you could devise some kind of study that explores that per the interest of the researcher. So that's one. The other one regarding challenges. So challenges where specifically? In research?
To get these kind of studies or
so it depends. I mean, as I mentioned before, I mean, there is the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health that was established as part of the NIH to look at such practices specifically. So funding is out there in these kind of, I don't like to use the word mainstream because it does dichotomize kind of, but yes, even in such spaces. But then there are a lot of other organizations that do some of this funding as well. John Templeton Foundation, for example, they recently, I think they did like a $5 million study on looking at specifically like spiritual practices and outcomes, processes and outcomes. So yeah, it's there. But again, if you're not really involved in that, and see, the other thing too is there is this kind of prevailing idea about religion and spirituality within the context of, psychology, that it's antithetical and it's not there. And like I said, both are true, right? There is that history of animosity, but there's also, at least even in modern times since the 90s, this huge field. I mean, even APA, I was an associate editor of spirituality and clinical practice for 4 years. Spirituality and clinical practice is an APA peer-reviewed journal. And there's another journal, Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. Last year, we did a special issue of the journal on Islamic spirituality in clinical contexts, right? So does that answer your question? Mm-hmm.
So I have a question. So last year, I taught a course on Islamic history. And one of the things that we did is we talked about Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, his book, Sustenance of the Soul. Yeah. We showed different Bimaristans from Andalus, from the Mamluks in Egypt, and talked about how there was, to some extent, an appreciation for mental disorders. There was diagnostic manuals of what it looked like. But we also made a distinction that a lot of the therapies, like music therapy, environmental changes, today we would think of as like cognitive behavioral therapy. And so one of the thoughts as you were speaking, I was like, well, it sounds like you're trying not to dichotomize, but at the same time, can you Islamically integrate with, Western psychology? I feel like Freud has such a strong hold on Western psychology. Is that shifting? And is that facilitating an integration?
Yeah. Well, your last point, I think it's a myth I think Freud just happens to be the most well known, but yeah, he gets taught. You teach it, it's there in the textbooks, but it's not, I think it's bigger in people's minds than it is in reality. I mean, in terms of his impact. So there's that. But
Can I clarify the
Yeah,
question? I'm
yeah.
sorry. So to clarify the question, when I say Freud, Freudian thing, not Freud as the person, but the idea that many of the mental disorders go back to, the ego and id, and they have to, experiences that we had as a child, unmet needs, and how they materialize later on in life. Whereas a lot of the Islamic emphasis from what we read from the Quran, for example, has a lot to do with us, our cognition, and how we're perceiving events that are unfolding in our lives, and how in many cases we need perspective, right? Of course, you have mood disorders and you have other psychological disorders, but it seems like the starting point in the Muslim ethos is just so different. It feels like you're trying to fit something into a whole different, and you yourself mentioned that it's like a different worldview. Can they really be synthesized is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think they can, because the worldview are things like ontology. Who are we? What did Allah tell us? This is how I made you. These are the components you have to who you are. This is who I am. This is the nature of the world, the nature of dunya, of all of these things. That's our starting point. But then it doesn't mean that we can't go off and engage in this field that exists today called psychology. Sometimes our scholarship might be examining all of that stuff that I just said: human ontology, epistemology, how do we know what we know? All of it. Sometimes the work is about that, which I call sort of the roots of Islamic psychology, these sort of philosophical underpinnings. But then you have the branches, which is sometimes those roots are there, but they're in the background. You might be operating where you are rooted in that, but that's not what your work is focused on. Your work is focused on maybe more branches, right? Application or something along those lines. So I don't know, does that speak to that at all? And I mean, going just brief, I think, even for example, like you said, Freud, or like this idea like childhood and stuff like that, I would say that even Islam talks about that, where it says, we're all born on fitra and our parents make us. Well, that's behaviorism, right? We see our parents and we come back, we become that, right? So, yeah, I mean, learned behaviors. Yeah, I mean, we think it's the Bobo doll, right? And Albert Bandura, behaviors, monkey see, monkey do. You see the kid hitting even Islam says that. That's why you're supposed to be around in good sohbah, right? Because we can learn these behaviors. I'll let you comment.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, Jazakumullah khair. This is fascinating. So I was really curious about what you mentioned about the effect that you see in people who are not Muslims. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the expectancy effects of these interventions. And it seems that somebody who buys into the Islamic worldview would likely derive more benefit or just have more buy-in into the intervention. But for somebody who doesn't have that worldview, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what their experience is, and would that be perhaps like a useful control for the Muslim arm to kind of tease out the different parts of this intervention and what their effects are?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, when we talk about research methods, I mean, there can be so many different kind of ways that you can, design a study. And then there's the whole other topic of what we talk about with our students, and that's spiritually integrated research methods, like actively engaging spirituality as a tool in the research process. And I know that that's not sort of what your question is, but I always have to say that whenever I get questions asked about methods. I mean, because we're talking about spiritual practices for health and well-being. Well, what about, we can also use spiritual practices as research tools. Like, have you ever actively, like, if you're working on a research project, have you ever tried to wake up for tahajjud and ask for guidance regarding your research project and the questions you might want to ask or something? I mean, it's a thing. It's a thing. So there's that. But in terms of what was the other part of your question about? Oh, yes. Right. So non-Muslims, like, what's the expectancy? Well, I can talk, I mentioned before the study that, it's been probably 10 or 15 years ago when I did what was it, like 2008, when I did my study on ruqya. And the participants in that study, they were non-Muslims. I mean, they had no expectation. And they actually had very, very powerful experiences, like reactions both during the treatment. And I actually carried that study out in Abu Dhabi, and like during the treatment, like one of the participants, I remember she said she felt like she went into a non-ordinary state of consciousness. Like she could feel the like an energy blip coming from the sheikh, and like she said something about like she felt like she almost went into like a trance. And they both had, a number of the participants had very, very powerful dreams afterwards, and also a feeling that the issues that they were presenting with had some level of healing to it. So, these were people that were not Muslims, but they were just articulate enough to sort of explain the experience that they were going through. So, ruqya, Quranic healing, reciting the Quran for healing. Yeah. So there's that, but then you can also look to, look at, going back to what I was talking about earlier, which is kind of spurred this whole project, which is the prevalence of non-Muslim spiritual practices today. Yoga, mindfulness, meditation, MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. This is, do people that are not from those traditions benefit from that? Are there people who are not Hindus that are doing yoga benefiting? Right? And then there's the whole discussion about secularizing these practices and taking them from the broader tradition and, kind of a cultural appropriation and those kind of thorny issues that you have to get into. And they should be discussed, but at the same time, when we're talking about Islamic spiritual practices and non-Muslim, my position is always Islam was sent for everybody, right? And we should be honored if somebody else wants to try something from our tradition, as opposed to offended that they're culturally appropriating something. Personally, that's my personal view.
The non-Muslims feel that they want to come in because of word like Allah, which is so alien. And a lot of it is negative. The word Allah is negative to the outside non-Muslim world. And so I think that's what your question was, is how will the non-Muslims come into it?
Well, they have to be interested. We're not forcing people who are not interested in. Yeah.
So I have a question here. So I was wondering, to your relatives and friends, how do you, what recommendations do you give to practice Islam, mindfulness or heartfulness day to day? What do you do?
Me personally. Yeah. And by the way, and we could have spent a little more time going in, I went over some of the chapters, but you guys hear the terms, things like muraqaba, muhasaba. These are also some of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about spiritual practices as well. Muraqaba and muhasaba. Well, muhasaba is like taking yourself to account, like going, like, when you're talking about like this whole idea of, purification and jihad and nafs and taking yourself to account, it's part of that process. Like being mindful of yourself, first of all, right? Having a level of self-awareness. You have no idea how many people go through life completely on autopilot. Never question, why do I do the things I do? Why do I feel like just complete autopilot, right? So it's being aware of yourself and having a level of introspection about who you are, what you're about, and why you do the things you do, your motivations and those sort of things. But then your question was, what do I do? Yeah. I would say my answer is, what do I not do? I mean, my whole life is just, different spiritual practices. I do all of my, my prayers are priority. I do extra, dhikr, or I have a whole, I don't know how much I go in here. Yeah. Yeah. What? Being a psychologist requires that of you, even when you're doing your training.
So
yes.
It's okay, everybody. We have like 10 questions.
Okay, Salam alaikum, and thank you for enlightening us with this important topic. So I have many questions from your but time is limited. I will touch on two. One is the epigenetic relation of brain development and the impact on the hypnosis, psychosis, and everything. There has been theory of hypoxia, the lack of oxygen to the brain, that is that's related to some epigenetic factors. And there has been some controversy on this, so we'll not go there. But the spiritual psychology has really a great impact on brain development. And then the impact of this on the role of hypnosis, which is a big controversial topic. I'm not going to touch upon that, bring that. And even some people have arguments that even dhikr may lead you to the hypnosis that may create some problems. Yoga nidra, even I Rest Institute has developed a good hypnotic technology about this. But I wanted your how do you differentiate all these processes or methodologies versus dhikr not leading us to hypnosis or hypnotic conditions that could lead to some worse conditions? I would not open up the epigenetic research topic. That's that's part of my research as well. So I don't want to discuss that. Jazakallah khair.
I'm not sure if I got what the exact question was. Well, your question seems to have some kind of assumption in it that hypnosis is bad and we want to avoid that. And I'm not really familiar with that context of your question. So I'm not sure if I'll give a sufficient answer, because I mean, hypnosis is a tool. I'm not personally trained in hypnosis. I have colleagues that are, and so, I mean, it's a tool. Dhikr is another tool. So I'm not really sure what the connection is and why you would want it to be the case or not be the case that dhikr leads to hypnosis or it doesn't, like that. I'm not really familiar with that sort of assumption that the question is loaded with.
We don't consider hypnosis as a bad factor that's related to depression.
I mean, it's a tool. It's a method. It's not one that I have personal experience. I mean, I haven't been trained in hypnosis, but I know that some of my colleagues have been.
I'm curious to hear what is the backing for that? The backing that there is something inside smoking the backing.
Sometimes it can be very effective in smoking cessation. You can hypnotize people into stop smoking.
Well, let's not get distracted. Are there other questions? We're not good. Let's take one from the sisters.
Thank you so much. Something that's very concerning right now is what's going on in Gaza and the inner trauma and intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
And what are some ideas that you may have that can help them heal? Because I feel like the perpetrators were also, second generation of that kind of trauma, and now they perpetrated it on the Gazans.
Well, I would say two things. One, no doubt, there are serious trauma-related issues that the sort of Palestinian population at large sort of has to deal with. But on the flip side of that, I would say we have more to learn from them than they have to learn from us. Because when you see how, and I mean, there's, khutbahs and everything given about their resilience and their ability to sort of hold on to their faith in the face of everything that they're sort of living. I think there's much more for us to learn from them than the other way around in terms of how do you do that? I mean, if you want to talk about psychological and spiritual strength in the faith, in the face of, decimation.
This one right here.
Thank you, Dr. York, for the introduction to this field that I was not aware of until today, and until I found out about this session. My question is about the potential avenues to mainstream this work, especially within American public. They've been bombarded with negativity about Islam, and I see like the hope that I see, and I'd like to hear you. What you think it would be, those promising fields could be, but it's the intersection of fields. Like you mentioned one of psychology and science, and one famous book there is The Biology of Belief by Bruce Lipton.
Bruce Lipton.
There's also the intersection of just spirituality and psychology, like chicken soup for the soul. As a matter of fact, I was Googling, we were speaking, I did not find one about Muslim soul. There was one about the Christian soul, one about the Jewish soul. Unfortunately, not yet about the Muslim soul. So that would be an interesting project.
Do I want to write it?
Yes. And another one is maybe about looking at the intersection of psychology, spirituality, and poetry. Like Wayne Dyer has one on the wisdom of ages, where he compiles basically different poems from different backgrounds and just try to tie that to the hardship that we would face in life. And those are just examples, but I'd love to hear your example and what you think would be promising avenues to just help with the mainstreaming basically your work.
Yeah, well, I would say all of those things are there. Even one of our faculty at the Al-Karam Institute, she's a published poet and a peace psychologist. And as part of our one of the modules in our Islamic psychology program is on poetry and poetry therapy. I mean, it's like a whole thing. Right? But in terms of, these areas of spirituality and healing and spiritual practice and public life, I actually think, I have a lot of hope for that. And earlier, years ago, when I published that study on the use of ruqya and on non-Muslims, that was one of the things that I said, that I think it has a great potential to positively impact public, otherwise negative perception of Islam. Because imagine if you get to know about Islam by a spiritual practice that you benefited from. Imagine, going to being a non-Muslim and having a beautiful experience of going and doing dhikr, and you benefited from that. So I think that there's a very, and so when you think about things like how we have mindfulness or meditation or yoga today, imagine if something an Islamic spiritual practice also became widely known, and people benefited from that. The potential that would have to correct people's perceptions of Islam.
Thank you very much. Actually, I fully agree with you that many of the psychological problems by keeping zikr fikr, actually our imam actually teaches us this all the time. And it definitely helps, or reading a Quranic ayah. And when during nighttime one cannot go to sleep, and contemplating on that will go in peace, actually. The second thing you mentioned about the addiction, and when I read about alcoholism and how Quranic ayah came that yasalunaka anil khamri wal maisir wa qul fihima ismun kabirun wa manafi'u linnas wa ismuhuma akbaru min nafihima. And this was the first time that there were, when Prophet ﷺ appeared, there were a lot of addiction. Alcohol was, every house had alcoholism. And the first came that there may be little of benefit because they are dealing with it or selling it, but the benefits are very little, and there is more harm. It's more harm in it. And then came that don't come drunk and gradually. And that gradualness, it did not come, stop alcohol one. And it would have killed a lot of people because they were addicted to alcohol. You can't stop something you've been. So it came gradually. And that was a great, great philosophy in that. And then came, don't come into mosque while drunk. And then finally stop drinking alcohol. The second thing, that was about the alcohol. So, and Quran itself says, وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. There is shifa in Quran, no doubt about it. So I firmly believe that what you said, zikr fikr, and reading Quranic ayah and contemplating on them will take away a lot of the psychiatric. And then the best of all, which our Prophet told us, having a smile, whether it is an enemy or it is your friend, and with a smile. And the smile is like it is a charity. And then if somebody sometimes, وَإِمَّا يَنْزَغَنَّكَ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ نَزْغٌ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ إِنَّهُ هُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. If sometimes when somebody deals us with, abuses us, everything, we really, as a human being, we will do the same too. But Quran teaches us, if you are friendly to that enemy then it is possible he will become your best friend. And this is a great eye, because when somebody fights us and then we fight back and tell him bad words also, later on we repent. Why did we do that? I should have kept quiet. And these Quranic ayahs have so much. Actually, I'm an ignorant person, but this is what you said. I agree fully. I'm myself a physician, but teaching the people to do the zikr fikr and reading a Quranic ayah and contemplating on it, it solves many psychiatric. And thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And I just want to say on, going back to like this whole idea of starting with Islam and our roots being there. I mean, if Allah tells us in the remembrance of God, do hearts find peace, like it's like, and then you want to just devise a study that explores, dhikr and some kind of, well, Allah already told us. You know what I mean? Like so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like Allah says, this is what's true. You know what I mean? So even things like that, impact research or, frameworks of psychology, because Allah already gave us a bunch of information that we can use. Thank you.
I don't need that, but congratulations on your academic work. A lot of things that we're saying, it's nice that you're putting into academic study. But I want to ask you, Wayne Dyer talks about intention. And that's something that I've always felt very strongly about the intention in the Quran. Have you done any studies on the word intention as what it does to a psychological mind of your ability to do something when you say, I intend to do something. And that again is a study. I wonder whether anybody has done that study. And the other one, where the Quran says, if you wake up at night and part of the night, you don't know the benefits of that. And is there any kind of spirituality benefits of that? Obviously, it says it in the Quran, but it would be wonderful to do some research.
Yeah. On this last, you mean like waking up for tahajjud and the benefits of that? I want to say that there has been some research exploring something along those lines. I don't think it's been within an Islamic context, but I think there has been some research on like waking up early or waking up like when it's, in the middle of the night or something along those lines. But in terms of your question on intention, I personally have not done any research on that, but certainly it is intention, niyyah is a very, powerful sort of psychological concept that could definitely be harnessed to benefit someone. But I personally have not done, published any research on that.
The spiritual aspect.
Of what? Of jinn?
Is there any kind of study on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of literature published on that topic. I'm not sure. And actually, when I did my study on the use of ruqya, usually ruqya is always written about from the context of jinn possession. And I actually bracketed that out. I said I was interested in ruqya for well-being, as opposed to, I don't know, I get freaked out by like the whole jinn and ghaib and all is like, I want to think, I think I watched too many scary movies when I was a kid and it scared me. So there's a lot of literature out there about jinn, but this is actually, kidding aside, this is actually a very, very important topic in that a lot of our colleagues discuss, and that is, look, we know ghaib exists. Allah said, right? Ghaib is there. Jinn exists. Jinn do possess people. We know that, right? And so how do we deal with that in the clinic, right? First of all, how do you know? How do you know? And this is something that, clinicians talk about, those of us kind of like in the field talk about all the time, because we don't necessarily have diagnostics to figure out, okay, how do we know if this is a jinn or is this somebody who's having, paranoia, schizophrenia or some, these are really tricky issues to get into.
The higher life, we're made out of the minerals, and the jinns are made out of gas. And so there's no such thing as a human being. And does it talk about that human beings get alive?
I think I would let Imam.
So I'll interject a little bit. The fact of the matter, when you get into the topic of jinn, is that 99% of what Muslims believe about jinn is made up. Because there is so little in the Quran and the Sunnah about it, that I would not say 100% of it is superstitious. I would say 99% of it is superstitious. It's an extrapolation of the 1%. Even the idea of a jinn possessing a person is based on very, very small number of texts. As an imam, and this is anecdotally, maybe once in every 5 or 6 years, you'll encounter a person that I subjectively will believe that's the case. It's far more often that people present to you with psychological conditions. And when you deal with so many people and you interact with people, you start seeing signs. We often have to, and not just me, all the imams, we often have to have conversations with people that, do you find joy in the things that you used to find joy in? And we start going through the signs of depression and we tell them that, well, I've noticed that X, Y, and Z and things that they may not realize about themselves, because the mental disorders are very common within our community and within the larger community. We're going to be getting ready for the Aisha prayer in the next few minutes. So what I'd like to do is let's please keep all of the questions very brief. Thank you.
And I would just say in closing about that too, I agree with you, Imam, that, the cases where it might be a jinn is really, really minuscule. The problem is that in a lot of Muslim communities, and especially in a lot of Muslim majority countries, the first idea is, oh, it's a jinn. It's like the opposite.
But isn't it a form of denial, right? Because
I think it's a cultural kind of. So I would say it's there,
or
but
that there's trauma.
yeah. So it's there, but it's not as big as I think a lot of people have intended.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your insightful description of the Islamic psychology. It is understood that Islamic psychology can impact state of mind of a human. There's a lot of, you have written all those kind of stuff. But my issue here is that the Islamic psychology has any impact on the state of heart, since every emotion initiates in the heart?
Yeah, definitely. Islamic psychology explores all of this. Like you're talking about the qalb being kind of like the seat of who we are, as opposed, we're not our brains, we're not just our mental processes. This is a foundational concept in an Islamic approach to psychology, which is distinct in relation to sort of mainstream psychology. But I would say it's shared with other faith traditions, right?
We always talk about the disease of hearts.
Yes.
So
Yes.
the thing is that
Yes, and I actually have a chapter published somewhere in some book, which I'm not recalling right now, talking about that, clinical applications of diseases of the heart. Yes, absolutely, and its relevance to psychology today. Absolutely.
Thank you. Sure.
A related question, Allah says in the Quran, "Lahum qulubun la yafqahuna biha," that they have hearts in which they cannot perceive with. So it seems, in the Islamic worldview, that the heart is the locus of perception and the sense of self. And nafs, of course, is problematic because nafs is used for everything, right? Good and bad and everything in between. But like you said, for the Muslims, we've always thought of the mind as like, that's just the CPU. But that's not, that's how we process, electrical signals. But our sense of self is in the heart, and the heart not necessarily being the anatomical heart, right? So within the larger field of psychology, is there any research into, where does a sense of self come from? And then also as an imam, one of the main concerns that we have is thinking about adolescence, right? We have a lot of youth, Eric Erickson, for example, he talks about all the different phases of development and how they go through like this role confusion, or they're trying to understand their sense of belonging, they're trying to fit in. So when we think of the Islamic mindful practices that you're talking about, what can we do for young people to allow them to feel that sense of belonging, right?
That's a big question. And when you find out the answer, let me know.
Tell them to come to ICCP, that's easy.
But the heart has its own brain. That's the way the heart
Well,
functions.
and we know that, there's something like 30,000 neurons in the physical heart, right?
Right.
So-
Okay.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It's so nice attending this session. I just wanted to shed light on this is the right time, like Isra Miraj is here, and Allah has invited us, Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, to the Arsh. And he initially, mashallah, has given 50 times of prayers. And then later on, it has been reduced to 5, right? So it is something has to do with Jibreel Islam, and comes and shows how to pray that. And if you see that our postures are so nice to dwell this living in this world with a lot of cardiovascular connection there. And all motors which we have in our body has to move in a sense of all sensitivities to be awakened every time. And we do have that so nice treasure of given from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who's the creator. And we do not have any R&D on this, research and development, for this matter, where we are just seeing other people like they're doing yoga. Oh man, yoga is so good. We have super yoga. We have something that we can research and develop and do certain things, which I do every time after my prayers, give my 15 minutes. I say that it's a quality time I'm giving to my body. So I do all those postures repeatedly with the nice breath, having a good full breath and exhaling out nicely. So I do my prayers also like that. So having a good breath and exhaling out my ayahs, my Subhana Rabbil Azim, Subhana Rabbil Ala. So you have a sense of mindfulness there. And you have a focus there, concentration there. And Subhana Rabbil Azim, such a nice tasbih, Subhana Rabbil Ala. All those attributes, can you relate that to this? So we need to develop in this area. And mashallah, there is a lot of potential to have a nice cardiovascular stamina developing, where we need everywhere we go, like for example, Hajj, we need to have that cardiovascular stamina to do all those exercises there. It's not an easy thing. Many people, they get sick. If you see that they are all limping there. And we have a fashion now to have chairs in our Islamic centers. And our prayers are just 10 minutes and they're gone. After that, there are no such practices where they have the sessions, they go for yoga and other stuff into gyms and everywhere. They are growing. The yoga was not, I'm from India, Hyderabad, and I haven't seen the yoga there initially. Now they are developing so much. And they are going into the offices. I work for FDA, and they have a mindfulness official yoga. So you can see that how they're doing it. And we already have so much there given from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, initially, if you think about it, and we are not making use of it. Mashallah, I just want to share this, and inshallah, I'm trying to propagate that, inshallah, in future. I will take some advice from you too, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, just imagine if dhikr became as popular in America as yoga is. Just think about that.
We can rename ruku a cobra, and sujood can be downward dog, and then everybody will sign up.
Other practice.
Okay, let's take one last question and we can conclude on that. Okay, bismillah. And then my apologies to those we couldn't talk about.
Assalamu alaikum and jazakallahu khair for your talk. My question is actually related to what was asked earlier. I think probably the first question is if you want to extend Islamic spirituality and mindfulness that most of the Muslims are already aware of, and there are anecdotal evidences that we know of, so we can actually do that. But if you want to extend it beyond Muslims, then it needs to be published somewhere where it's peer reviewed. And that publication I understand. My question is related to it. So for impactful outcomes, we need to have basically measurable outcomes. And those measurable outcomes require some metrics where basically then we can, where we present it. I'm sure people are doing it. So my question is, what are those metrics that you're using right now?
Well, we're not talking right now. We're not talking about a specific. We're talking about in general. But there, you can go into the research and you can see what kind of research is being done, and you can see what their metrics are. I mean, it's a whole field.
Yeah. Okay, I understand, but I was just asking you what those are because I'm not in psychology, and I'm not publishing in.
Well, it would, that changes from study to study. With, yeah, so, but that, like, that wasn't like a clinical trial. That was, I used a qualitative research method. So that's more subjective kind of, you know, so it was a different methodology. So, but the sort of processes or outcomes would depend on whatever particular study that you're talking about.
So I can see that obviously everybody's really fascinated. This is what Q&A at ICCP is, like rapid fire. But mashallah, I can see that everybody really enjoyed your presentation. If you guys are interested, I would really encourage you to explore her books, the ones that she's edited and the ones that she's written herself, and continue the conversation. We hope that we'll have you again in the future. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and we thank you for being here in this cold month and this cold evening, and really warming in our hearts and also really getting our minds going. Thank you so much. We'll call the adhan for Salatul Isha. We'll pray the Isha prayer, and then following that, we'll proceed to build